I'd like to start by quickly introducing ourselves. My name is Max LaFortune, and I'm a director here at NPS Prism. And I'm joined by my colleagues, Jason Barrow, founder of NPS Prism, and Rob Markey, a partner and global leader in our customer practice here at Bain. Jason and Rob, thanks so much for joining.
Yeah, excited to be here.
It's a pleasure.
So we're here today to unveil the latest iteration of our US benchmarks. We're excited to announce that the inaugural report, which we released last year, was published and downloaded by thousands of CX leaders across major global organizations. We're excited by the momentum and the value that this brings to leaders like yourselves. So we're committed to publishing this report on a regular basis with fresh data and insights. So for those who may be less familiar with NPS Prism, Prism is our syndicated customer experience benchmarking tool. This tool allows companies to compare their customer experience against that of their competitors and dig into individual customer episodes, channels, and other drivers of that experience. The product is extremely comprehensive. It encompasses over 600 surveyed companies across over 10 industries, covers over 30 individual customer journeys per industry, and it includes over 1 million customers surveyed with quarterly data refreshes. We created this report for a few main reasons, specifically to enable customer experience leaders like yourselves to measure customer sentiment and understand, what does good look like in my industry, to monitor for score changes over time so you can see how that customer experience is evolving, and to identify opportunity areas, both within and across industries. And we hope that this can serve as a baseline to inform go-forward CX strategy and show why benchmarking is a key input to determining CX performance. We also believe that Prism is a great way to understand key areas of opportunity to prioritize based on what matters most to customers. So I'll quickly just point out a few changes since our inaugural report was released. First, we've added a few new industries here that you can see on the left-hand side, which include pharmacy, home improvement, and annuities. We've also seen some shifting in terms of leaders, with names like Publix and Mint Mobile showing up for the first time. So we'll jump in. What we've got here is the latest leaderboard, which reflects average NPS scores over a 1-year period, which helps smooth out any seasonality given our data is updated every quarter. We show a mixture of brand level and product level NPS scores depending on the industry, as some of these industries have been broken out at the product level, like US consumer banking on the left. Each vertical line represents a range of NPS scores for a given industry or sub-industry, with the leaders highlighted by the logos that you see on the page. And in case folks are wondering, we will be sharing the full report with all attendees on this call after the fact, so you can dive in more detail. So Jason, would love to just start with you and hear some of your high-level reactions to what you're seeing on this latest leaderboard.
Yeah, thanks so much, Max. And Rob, obviously, will be great to get your reactions here as well. When I look at this list of companies, the number one thing is this is quite an impressive set of companies. A lot of real customer experience pedigree across the groups with the Navy Federals and USAAs and T-Mobiles and Mints of the world that we're not surprised to see. But as I take a step back, what's most interesting is that I always describe it, I think there's a lot of human on this page. What I notice first is that the digital attacker brands aren't necessarily at the top of these, and I know that they're having impact, and we'll be able to talk about that more as we go. But there's a lot of human, and it's sort of, as I take a step back, one of the big conversations that a lot of our clients are having is sort of how big and how fast to push digital, how big and how fast to push AI. And I take a look at this page, and I think there's a lot of human channels, a lot of human interaction, a lot of empathy across the brands that are winning here. And so that's the first thing that I noticed. The other big thing that I noticed is that the largest of the companies in any one of these columns don't look like they're at the top of these either. And it makes me wonder how much sort of being a niche player or a small player ends up mattering in this race to CX leadership. I don't know, Rob, what are your reactions?
No, I mean, I have the same reaction. I think that one of the things that's always interesting to me is to see a company like USAA spread across so many of the categories, and know that USAA is both an innovator in certain digital episodes and also really well known for the quality of its human to human service.
Yeah, no, it's interesting. Navy Federal does really well on the digital aspects as well. If you go one more page, Max, we can start to talk about some of these things, because one of the other things about NPS Prism, for those of you who haven't seen it before, is that it's really not about these top level scores once we get into the depth of it. It really is the ability to break apart the why it is that companies are either doing well or not well within an industry. Just to bring this to life a bit, we brought what we call our bubble charts for two of our industries. This is credit cards on the left, and this is auto on the right, this is auto insurance on the right. And again, for those of you who haven't seen these before, the idea is each of the dots on these pages are a thing that your customers do with you, either in banking or credit cards or in auto insurance. And each of the dots they're sorted three ways. The dots that are to the top of the chart are more detractor creating at the margin when they go poorly. The ones that are to the right are more promoter creating when they go well. And the size of the bubble is frequency. So you can think of this like a month or a year in the life of a customer in banking and credit cards on the left, or in auto insurance on the right. And what you start to notice is that there are large bubbles in the bottom left. These are things that are happening with a lot of frequency, but don't have a lot of emotional impact at the margin. These are things that we typically think of as routine or table stakes type journeys. But then you get all of these small bubbles that are far away from the bottom left. These are these moments of truth or detractor creators or promoter creators, but these low volume but high emotion journeys. And if you take a step back if you think about the folks who are winning on the previous page, like if you look at Navy Fed and USAA, their leads in the small bubbles on the left-hand side are bigger than their leads in the big bubbles in the bottom left. The places where they're really making their gains and opening clear water to the brands behind them is that they are doing really well in those moments of truth, those things which aren't happening with the same volume. Like that's where they're having 20, 30 point leads, whereas in the bottom left, they're having 5, 10, 15 point leads. And so that's one of the things that you see very clearly. And so you end up with this element of, well, can you win? Like if you think about what the digital players are going to be super good at, the digital players are going to be really, really good at these large bubbles in the bottom left. They are very good at the bubbles where being fast and easy is most important. And so if you think about the differences across these markets, one of the interesting things is that in banking, we do see the digital banks doing quite well because they're really good in the bubbles in the bottom left, but they're also good at handling those rare but emotional journeys. And I'll talk about that more in a second. And then go ahead, Rob.
Yeah, I think Jason, it's worth just doing a little bit of a additional deep dive. Like think about what it's like when you have a fee on your account that you don't understand or believe is wrong. And think about what it feels like to try to get that resolved. If you do it digitally,
yes,
the likelihood that you're going to get that fee reversed feels really low. The likelihood that you're going to feel as a customer that even if it is reversed, you were heard and understood and feel like you got justice is actually reasonably low. So you take these things, like I haven't had a fee dispute in ages, but if I did and it went poorly, it would be really big deal. And if it went really well, it would reassure me or restore a little bit of my faith and trust in the organization I was doing business with. And I think that's why it matters so much to distinguish between high volume, low variability of outcome versus low volume, low frequency, low incidence, and very high variability of emotional outcome.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's exactly the way that I describe it. Is there are certain types of journeys and episodes where saying no digitally is very hard to do. Mm-hmm. Fee disputes in banking, claims and insurance, places, break fix and pricing disputes in cable is another one that's like that. Things where doing it digitally really isn't designed to work very well. And so those are the places where the folks who have still figured out human channels are really winning, but they're also winning when the customers try it digitally and then end up in human channels, those are the companies who also handle that transition better. And so one of the things that Navy Federal and USA do super well is they handle those channel jumps better than in a lot of other companies. You feel like you're starting over. And I will tell one story on the left-hand side with banks. I had 2 digital bank clients last year where one of them was 20, 30 points ahead of the other one. And if you looked at their performance in the bubbles in the bottom left, they were basically the same. Think of it as the apps were basically the same. The gaps were that one of the digital banks had figured out how to handle the small bubbles well, and the other one had tried to do a no call center strategy. They were trying to let's handle everything digitally. There's no way to ever get in touch with a human. And for that institution, that actually led them to being behind and not gaining nearly as much share as the digital bank who had figured out how to handle the full range of bubbles effectively. And so you don't want people in your call centers doing the stuff in the bottom left, but there needs to be some way to handle those complicated journeys in human. I think a lot of that's going to be in chat going forward and AI. This doesn't have to mean call centers, but there has to be a way that you get to ask and complicated questions to question the no's that you're getting. And I think in a lot of these markets, organizations that are rushing way too fast to digitize everything in some universal way are the ones that are struggling. Because, and Rob, you and I talk about this all the time, you have to de-average. Like, you can't just say, is digital better than human? The answer is, well, which bubble are you talking about? And for some of the bubbles, the answer is absolutely digitize the whole thing. And for some of them, really be super careful.
I think one of the other things that you always point out about this sort of chart and the data underneath it. So underneath this is actually not only data that gives us where things show up on the X and Y axes, but also for each company that we track, how they perform. And one of the things you always point out is that there are certain types of interactions, certain types of episodes that you just want to avoid, like you want to eliminate. So fee disputes, to go back to this one, the best outcome is you just don't have as many as another competitor. Whereas, let's just say using or signing up for additional services is something you really want a lot of. And in the Prism data that you have, you can actually compare how different companies are performing in terms of the incidence of the worst types of episodes underneath these, not just how bad they are when they go bad. And I think that that's something that's worth thinking a little bit about, because I don't know any other way to get that relative to competitors than to do a benchmarking study.
Yeah, and I'll give you a good story in grocery. So obviously Amazon does quite well in grocery as a digital player. They're not the lead, but they're pretty close, and obviously doing well in the convenience missions as well. But if you take the type of lens you were just talking about, one of the journeys that is a big red bubble for grocery is stockouts. So I wanted to buy something and it turned out I couldn't have it, and I have to go through a substitutions experience to figure out what it is I'm going to do. If you look at Amazon digital grocery, the reason they're way ahead is that their customers stock out substantially less than their competitors. You are about half as likely to run into a stock out experience with Amazon digital as you are with Instacart, for instance. And one of the reasons that's so important for Amazon is because that substitutions experience is actually really hard to handle digitally. The grocers who handle that substitutions experience really well have actually layered a personal shopper type person that you can interact with to figure out, oh, they're out of the strawberry yogurt. Am I okay with peach? Like, there's that type of interaction that turns out is better than like the algorithmic one. And so, but you're exactly right, Rob. The path to sort of leadership is actually to have the stockouts happen less, not necessarily to have that experience be much, much better.
Let me tell you how good I am at recovering from something bad. It's a good thing to do. It's a good thing to do, but let's not.
Well, I mean, this comes up. We're all cable customers, and like the first time you and I ever built one of these in cable, the bubbles that pop in the upper left are all about break fix and fights about the money. Like that's what really makes customers unhappy in cable. Like you don't want outages, you don't want to have to deal with the outages, and you don't want your prices changing all the time and arguing about them.
When
And
you
if
don't
you
want
look at
charges on your bill that you just cannot
don't even
friggin'
understand.
understand. Exactly.
Yeah. So if you look at like what T-Mobile and Mint and the other players and the Netflixes of the world who are doing really well in the space, part of what they're doing is they've taken all of those upper left bubbles from cable and they've made them go away, as opposed to, they figured out how to have the price change experience just be dramatically better. It just hardly happens.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So is it worth pivoting into some of those other types of thematic things that we would think about?
Yeah. Well, maybe let me just characterize what I took away here, because this is something that I've kind of been thinking a lot about, which is when we look at the companies that are at the top of the list, right? One of the things we find is that while a lot of money and attention is getting spent on digital transformation, the companies that are consistently at the top of the leaderboards are actually investing in human interactions. They're actually doing a very good job on the human side. It's not that they're ignoring digital, but they're not redirecting all of their dollars there. And you don't hear people at the executives at those companies saying, we don't need to worry about how the call centers are performing because we're going to just replace them all with digital self-service. The second observation would be that when you look at the leaders, by and large, they're smaller, more focused companies. It's not universally true, but in many cases, they're companies that have real clarity about a particular segment of customers against whom they are designing their entire business. And they're making explicit trade-offs to forego being great for other segments of customers. And as a result, they're actually not only doing really well in terms of NPS, but they're doing really well financially. Like you look at those leaderboards and they're dominated by companies that have great financial returns. I'm going to skip the incumbent versus upstart thing for 1 minute, and I want to go actually then to just reinforce the other observation is that the companies that seem to be winning at the top of the leaderboards are the ones that are actually systematically identifying and excelling at those reasonably rare episodes that have really high emotional content and therefore create big swings in customer loyalty. Again, they're not terrible on the routine. That's not their sole focus.
That's right.
And then the final thing is that there are a disproportionate number of kind of insurgents or upstarts relative to incumbents. And it is curious why upstarts would and insurgents would have an advantage over companies with much more resource, much greater skill, experience, capability, data than companies that are newer to the game.
Yeah, and again, I think this obviously interacts with the scale point. And again, we can get into this a bit. I think some of it is because it's hard to be, a perfect design for each segment, and each segment wants a slightly different thing. And so if you try to deliver the average, the customers aren't going to be thrilled. There's definitely that piece of that. But there's also something here to the pace and ability to innovate, and the importance of understanding that the definition of how good is changing. Customer expectations are changing. And the organizations that are where it's way too hard to do anything different than how we did it yesterday or last year, those organizations are going to struggle in a world in which the customer expectations are moving so quickly.
Can you give an example?
Yeah, I mean, look, I think I think the video market for cable is exactly like this. Like we all saw it. It's like we all watched it happen in real time. It's like the cable companies had full-on monopolies essentially over who, hours watched and money paid for video services. And like the world started innovating. It was clear that how customers wanted to watch was very different than how they had been watching and consuming content. And the incumbents were just way too slow relative to the insurgents. that now the market is almost completely flipped over. It's like the old guard basically isn't in the video business anymore. And like that, it's like that didn't have to be the outcome. Like there were, in theory, you would have thought that the incumbents had all the advantage as they had all the customer relationships at the beginning, but that's not how it played. And so you see similar type dynamics going on in terms of, well, how do people want to interact with their banks? How do they want to interact with their cars?
Well, let me stay on the video thing. So this is like your cable company or your subscription to television services over wires, right? That's what you're talking about.
Yeah.
Now, I could make an argument that the incumbents were at a significant disadvantage because of the physical infrastructure that they had to maintain, much of which is old wires and technology that was
Sure.
assembled from acquisitions of lots of little regional and local companies. And as a result, they had to spend a lot of energy and time and money fixing up their infrastructure and making it all work together. Whereas, say, an insurgent, I used to live in San Francisco until just a few months ago, and we had this little company called Sonic that provided our internet service,
Right.
switching from video to internet, but you'll get the point in a second.
Yeah.
They didn't have any legacy equipment to deal with.
No.
So when they came and they installed something in my house, and it just worked. And they had one technology system and one way of, they didn't have to worry about all of that. And I bring this up because I think in every industry, there are issues that incumbents face that draw resources that in some cases can make it very difficult for them to invest enough in customer relationships, in product upgrades, in service capabilities to keep up. And those decisions, do I invest in upgrading the pipes and the stuff that's behind the walls and nobody sees? Or do I invest in making the customer experience better or the product snazzier? Those are the tough decisions that need to be made with data and analysis and understanding of the likely costs and benefits in terms of customer relationships.
Mm-hmm.
And so part of what you're describing with the incumbent video providers is they made bets that actually didn't pay off.
There's some of that, and I completely get you're encumbered with your existing stuff. I'm gonna go off script a little bit here because this brings up. So again, we have lots of these instruments that go across countries. So one of the interesting things that has popped in the last 6 to 12 months in the UK, in UK banking, is Chase's entry. So Chase is obviously a well-established player in the US. They're not an NPS leader. They're obviously doing reasonably well, but they are not up with the digital attacker brands or USA and Navy Fed in the US. They have entered the UK market, and they are ahead of Monzo. They are ahead of Starling. They are at NPS something in the range of 70 as sort of a unencumbered fresh entry from Chase into the UK market, and it's really resonating. But they don't look like US Chase in the UK. They look like, if Chase were going to start afresh, what would they look like? Sort of unencumbered from the traditional stuff. And the customers in the UK are really liking it.
You bring up banking, and that actually is a good moment to transition to a question that Kent Pennicook put in the Q&A about a mid-sized bank, a $12 billion bank. And the issue he's raising is actually a really common one. And that is, he's saying their executive team is really focused on understanding performance relative to very specific peer set that are very much like them, and not very interested in comparing to the much larger regional banks or the mega banks. And so I think there are two questions underneath this. One is that a good idea? If you're the leader if you're in the executive team of a smaller bank, how do you think about what competitive set you should be using for comparison? And then the next question is, how do you cost effectively benchmark when you're a smaller institution competing against other smaller institutions?
Yeah, no, those are great questions. I think the first question, so one of the things that we see, a lot of organizations think of their competitor sets too narrowly. And I always describe it as when your customers are choosing who they are going to bank with, buy from, who are they choosing? So if they're losing customers to the digital banks or to the national banks or to the large regionals, you do sort of have to occasionally take a step back and say, well, why are my customers switching? And so I often start with the competitor set is the set of places where your target customers are choosing from and moving to.
And I want to underscore this. You don't get to decide who your competitors are. Your customers do.
Your customers tell you. One of the pieces of data we have in Prism is our inflows and outflows page, which makes this very stark for clients. When you're winning and losing customers, who are you winning and losing them from? And I think from within that frame, but then there's a second thing, which is what if the places that you're winning and losing from are too small to be able to benchmark this way? What do you do? Which I think is a separate question. So in a couple of our instruments, and we do this for pharmacies, we have this a bit for bank, where we essentially have aggregated views of the small guys. Like we have a roll up of mom and pop pharmacies, for instance, we're actually winning. And we can give sort of an aggregated view of when people are really liking mom and pop pharmacies or small community banks or small grocers. What is it they're liking about them?
Well, and I suspect that this is where Kent's leadership team is coming from, is the smaller banks are the ones that matter most because they are better at drawing away his company's customers. And that is the relevant competitive set that for a higher bar. And what you're saying is it's going to be really hard to get good benchmarks at a cost-effective way against individual players.
Right.
But you can do good benchmarks against an aggregation of these smaller players.
And one of the benefits of Prism, we can get reasonably deep. The way that I think about it in bank is we can get pretty clear views on any bank that's at about 0.5% of the market.
Mm-hmm.
So again, that's obviously, it doesn't get down to all the regional bank, but it can get reasonably small. And similar thing that we have for grocery, you can do this in a way where you're not only just looking at the very largest, because the answers on what's good and not good really does differ across types of players, and you need that. But at the end of the day, the key thing with the leadership team is alignment on what good looks like and which of the gaps are the things that are driving you to lose customers at times that you don't want to be losing.
I guess, Jason, another question that is reasonable to start to ask here is, because in banking, in automotive, in a number of these other categories, one of the things you're alluding to is a de-averaging, a disaggregation of the data in order to get to higher order insights and observations. Can you give an example of a place where in this data, the high level conclusion would actually lead you down the wrong path, but a deeper dive underneath the data would give you a better answer?
Yeah, I'll give an example. The story I think I've told to you multiple times. It's usually of the flavor of within one of the journeys, people are sure that one of the drivers is the most important one and almost like the only one. There are actually other drivers that matter. So the example that's come up a lot recently in our work is that in grocery, obviously checkout's an important journey. We've all been grocery customers. We all know checkout matters. A lot of the grocers are convinced that checkout time is essentially the key and in a lot of ways only determinant of are customers happy or not. Basically, the longer they wait, the less happy they are. The shorter the wait, the more happy they are. And one of the things that pops in the grocery data is that there are actually these other measures which are sort of softer and harder to quantify, but actually matter a ton. They include things like, was the person friendly and smiles when you get to the front of the line? There's a one of the big things that matters is what we call blame rate. This is, one of the things that's true. And again, you can think of, if you think of some of the grocers who are doing super well in grocery but have long wait times, they're like Trader Joe's and Costco. And my guess is a lot of us have shopped at a Trader Joe's and Costco. One of the interesting things is that they're not the fastest, but they do really well on checkout NPS. But the reason they do is that their customers don't blame them for lines, which again is it's an element where when the other grocers look at the data, they think this is unfair. They're like, but wait a minute, we're faster than them. Why are they ahead of us? And it's because the balance of wait time with the soft element, where the soft element is the customer feels like you were doing everything you could to get them through the line as fast as they can, in which case you're not mad. But it strikes, it's one of these things where it's counterintuitive, feels unfair, but it's true.
So I want to point out another aspect of this, because I was looking at that data and reflecting on it as well. And something else occurred to me on top of this. So one way to look at that data is as a grocer who has long lines or has short lines and doesn't feel like they're getting credit for it. Another way to look at it is to ask yourself the question, what could I do to make the line experience better? And not just being friendlier after the end of the line. Mm-hmm. Could I take a page out of the Disney playbook and make the line part of the experience, a deliberate part of the experience? Yep. And I think that at least in some Trader Joe's stores and at Container Store and at, I think if I remember correctly, Bed Bath & Beyond, if you think about the way that they organize the lines, what they do is they try to make that part of the experience a little interesting by lining the line itself with not just candy and gum, but really interesting impulse items that draw your attention. And I had this epiphany when I was at a Trader Joe's and I was watching every single shopper in the line staring and looking at all the stuff as even when the line wasn't long, like as they passed through, they slowed down to look at all this stuff because it was interesting.
Yeah, it was interesting.
And it makes you wonder in other categories, when you have customers queuing, can you do something to make it more interesting than playing repetitive hold music or giving them a blank wall to stare at?
Yeah. And this comes up and I always describe this as some of these levers are quote unquote cheaper. Like, when you think about fee disputing in bank, we started off talking about that. But if you take a step back and say, what makes customers happy in fee disputing? It's two things. It's about saying yes as fast as you can. And it's about saying no as nicely as you can. And organizations, they get super frustrated because it takes them a day or 2 days to say yes to a fee dispute. And then they're surprised that the customers aren't okay. Like, you don't get the credit for the yes if you make the customer work a day.
It's like I paid out money. I reduced my revenue line item, and yet I'm still getting dinged.
Right. Yeah. So almost every bank, they're like, well, the reason that bank A, B, or C is doing so well is because they say yes more often. And that's really not where the slope is. The slope is actually in differences in empathy during the no's and the share of customers who get an immediate fee reduction. Like the whole point is the ones that you were going to say yes to eventually, just say yes right away. And you get like a 40, 50 point NPS lift versus making them wait 2 days before you do it. And that shows up in bank, it shows up in cable, it shows up in all these places where if you make the customers fight for the thing that they felt like they deserved, you actually end up paying the money and not getting the customer credit.
Rob, your point on grocery is interesting too. I was thinking about my own experience at Whole Foods recently, where they've done the sort of make the line interesting approach. And I almost look forward to seeing what's in that area. But as a slight tweak, they only do that for self-checkout. So if you don't go to self-checkout, you don't get the interesting line experience in the same way.
There could be method to that madness, Max. I don't know, but it's an interesting point.
Yeah. As a result, I often go to self-checkout there.
Yeah. But you will. One of the things that also pops in our grocery data is if you get a mismatch of preference with type of checkout. So if you just look at the data and say, hey, is self-checkout better than man checkout? You'll get one answer. But the problem is actually when you make somebody do self-checkout when they didn't want to, or vice versa.
Yeah.
And that actually makes people unhappy. So you have to know what your customers want. And you can't just sort of force the channel shift without customer education and communication.
True. And let's be clear, you can do self-checkout very poorly. I've had experiences where I felt like I was I really felt horrible about the experience because there was somebody hovering over me, correcting me at every swipe of a product. Yeah. I'd love to see more Q&A from the audience. It may be that we're just doing such a good job that folks who are listening in have no additional questions, or it may be that there are burning questions that people have and they just haven't figured out how to do the Q&A. But for me, at least, at the bottom of the screen is a little Q&A bubble, and if you click on that, you can ask us a question very directly. We did have a couple of other things that we were talking about. We've already discussed human interactions, but we didn't necessarily talk about them in the context of AI and generative AI. And I guess one question would be, I made the case you should continue to invest in human channels, but somebody could make a reasonable case to say, I don't know, I think you should be investing in AI so that we can use machines to be empathetic. Machines are infinitely patient. They don't have bad days. We could train them to do a good job on a fee dispute. What do you think?
Yeah, again, I always split it into the yeses and nos. I completely agree that AI can be trained to say yes to the types of customers you want to say yes to and say yes in a super fast way. And AI might even help with the algorithmic decision making of who's supposed to get an instant yes. So that piece of the problem, totally get it. The customers aren't going to care that it's not a live person. But with any of these things, I worry about how the no's go. And so with any of these things, I worry about the path where the customer is not going to just take no for an answer. What do we think is going to be happening? And I think even in the AI path, the question is there an off-ramp to human? And sort of when would you have one? And how do you manage that transition smoothly? And it's sort of like, and you see this in the chatbots, like it's a transition from something that is a bot to chatting with an actual live person. And as long as that transition is smooth enough and you don't have to start over, I can imagine this being quite helpful. But where organizations, I think, fall down is that they focus on that happy path, the path to the yes, and they convince themselves they built something that is complete. And what they need is to think about the bad path too and say, is this helping or hurting?
So I think Jason, this is actually addressing a question that John Strohacker put into the Q&A, which is, or at least partially, it's glancingly addressing it, which is, the basic arithmetic behind NPS. You could argue that there may be in some companies a real significant opportunity to improve NPS by reducing the number of detractors, and in other companies a real opportunity in creating more promoters. And if I change his question a little bit, under what conditions do you think a company should focus on detractor reduction versus promoter creation?
Yeah, I'm not sure there's a universal answer to this question. I think it depends a bit on where they're starting from. Like a lot of companies don't have a lot of detractors, and so the lift is almost automatically from passives to promoters. Sometimes the real lift in the economics comes from moving people on one of the steps of the journeys versus the other. And so it's a clarification. And sometimes it's about the effort and cost in order to fix the things that are causing the problems. And so I haven't found sort of a universal answer to that. Like if you look in grocery, the real lift in share a wallet gain really comes from passives to promoters. Like that's where the lift is. And so if I had this question from a grocery client, I would say you actually have to figure out how to, because what happens in grocery is that the promoters give you much, much more of their full shopping wall. Like essentially you get their whole range of shopping missions. And that happens the most, like at HEB is like the leader in this type of thing. Like HEB customers shop HEB for almost everything. And like that's the dynamic you're looking for. And that dynamic comes once they are raving promoters.
Mm-hmm.
So that's what you see, and that's where the economics is. So that's what you want to focus on.
Yeah, I have a strong bias to tuning the answer to this question to what your starting point is. So I completely agree with you. There was a question about insights in banking on authenticating customers. I'm going to actually suggest that that's a pretty focused question, which we can do offline if the person wants to follow up with us.
Sure.
Christopher Hosner asked or suggested that curating the steps within the journey, like the Costco example, can elevate CX, and was asking, what advice do you have to better see the opportunities to create that sort of curated experience? How does the data here provide answers to that?
Yeah, and again, we're pushing on this dimension. Some of this is obviously there can be lots of different paths that you can go down. You and I, Rob, we've obviously gotten lost in the instrument lots of times. And so, Chris, part of what we're trying to do, obviously, is make the tool easier and easier, where those key parts of, which of the questions in the journey deep dives are having the biggest slope, and places where you have, like, we're trying to automate that stuff in a way to make it easier for you guys to find these things without necessarily needing a curated run through with us. And again, this is just part. And the other thing is, as we do this more and more, we find these things and we start to talk about them. We refine exactly what it is we're asking. But this is the part of this is that it's a journey, and that, like the thing around, the blame rate for the line, like that was a bit unexpected. And like there was a hypothesis. We didn't necessarily expect that to be where the story was, but you sort of find it once you dig enough.
I want to take one more topic here real quick before we close out, which is Christopher Hosner again raised a point. He was trying to say focusing on passives is easier because it's often a very big pool and it's less effort. It takes less effort to turn them into promoters. And I'm going to make an argument against that.
Okay.
Maybe you can argue the other way, but I actually find historically, like, and I've only been doing this for 20 years with a couple hundred companies, but engaging passives is often the hardest thing to do because they will say, I'm fine. I'm perfectly happy. And they're not actually that interested in engaging. And I think that in most organizations, not universally true, but in most organizations, you're going to actually find that there are more people who are detractors who want to be promoters than there are passives who want to be promoters. A lot of the data we have would say that the detractor population bifurcates into these two groups: one who have given up on you and are just captive for a little while, and another who are used to be promoters, want to be promoters, and are angry because they feel disappointed. Those people can be turned around. Passives, they're so much harder, I think.
I think that's right. And we talk about this like engagement rate. Like your engagement rate is definitely U-shaped, higher with your detractors and your promoters than with your passives. And so it can be harder to get the at-bats with your passives in a sense to convince them.
Yeah. There are exceptions. Everything we say, there's exceptions. But rule of thumb, focus on creating more promoters, building stronger relationships with your promoters, and turning around that subset of detractors who actually want to be promoters.
Well, I think this is probably a great point to end. Thank you all for all the great engagement, and obviously Rob and Jason for sharing your insights. For folks on the call who would like to dive deeper into your own company's scores or those of your industry, please do reach out. We love hearing from you all, and you can email me directly. My email is there if you'd like, or you can reach us on our website at npsprism.com. Thanks again for joining, and for those who may have submitted questions that we didn't get to, again, feel free to reach out, and we're happy to engage one-on-one. Thanks so much, and have a great rest of the day.